It is important to identify limitations that invoke 35 U.S.C. 112F because these limitations govern the broadest reasonable interpretation of claim language, and treating them properly can prevent potential over-assertion of claims. We will cover what is a 35 U.S.C. 112F limitation, as well as what 112F requires. We will also cover how one recognizes if a claim does or does not invoke interpretation under 112F, and how to evaluate an applicant's response to our determination of whether 112F has been invoked. Here, we see a typical apparatus claim for a camera. An apparatus claim defines an invention by the structural elements it includes. On this slide, we see a potential corresponding method claim of taking a picture. We see that a method claim defines the invention by a series of positive steps. So now we come to the claim shown in the slide, and what do we have? An apparatus claim or a method claim? As it turns out, it is an apparatus claim. Elements in a claim can be expressed as either means in an apparatus claim or the step of doing something in a method claim. The interpretation of both comes from what is described in the specification as the corresponding structure, material, or acts and equivalents thereof. The claim shown on this slide is an apparatus claim having functional claimed limitations. 35 U.S.C. 112F defines how this language is to be interpreted. These types of claims are commonly called means plus function claims. They must be written as a combination of elements, meaning that the applicant should not present what would be a single element or a single means plus function limitation. The claimed element must be expressed as a means or other non-structural term or step to perform a specific function. The claim must not recite sufficient structure, material, or acts that would accomplish that same function. The final important requirement is that the specification must describe the structure, material, or acts that provide the corresponding recited function. The next few slides will cover how claim language under 35 U.S.C. 112F is interpreted differently from other claim language. Remember that during patent examination, claims must be given their broadest reasonable interpretation consistent with the specification. This slide points out what broadest reasonable interpretation means for words found in claims when an examiner is interpreting those words. However, claim limitations falling under 35 U.S.C. 112F require the examiner to construe the limitations as covering the corresponding structure, material, or acts described in the specification and equivalents thereof. As this slide points out, applicant has the responsibility of linking structure to the function for the convenience of employing 35 U.S.C. 112F. Please note that no new matter may be added to the specification. On this slide, we provide some examples of possible 35 U.S.C. 112F claim language. Please note that 112F is not limited only to the words means for or step for. Be careful in that some language may appear to fall under 35 U.S.C. 112F, but does not, and the converse may be true as well. Examiners should make sure a claim meets claim language guidelines before analyzing a claim under 35 U.S.C. 112F. We'll now cover how examiners should evaluate claims under 35 U.S.C. 112F. First, you need to determine whether the limitation invokes 35 U.S.C. 112F. This is important because the broadest reasonable interpretation may change depending on whether 112F is invoked. If 112F is not invoked, then the limitation must be interpreted under broadest reasonable interpretation in light of the specification and the prior art. For example, compare these claim limitations. An apparatus comprising a filter with the limitation an apparatus comprising means for separating particulates from a solution. Per the disclosure, means for separating particulates from a solution is linked to the filter as the corresponding structure, but one may have a broader meaning than the other. When a claim limitation uses the phrase means for or step for, coupled with functional language, the claim limitation is presumed to invoke 35 U.S.C. 112F. When a claim limitation does not use the phrase means for or step for, the claim limitation is not presumed to invoke 35 U.S.C. 112F. The terms listed can be generic placeholders for means for. This extension of substitutes for means for does not apply to step for, as such claims are relatively rare, and the case law is not well developed. Method claims typically recite actions associated with a function, and not simply functions. A claim limitation should be interpreted according to 112F if it meets the following three-prong analysis for means-type claims. Prong A requires the claim limitation to use the phrase means, or a term used as a substitute for means that is a generic placeholder. Prong B requires the phrase means, or the substitute term to be modified by the functional language, typically linked by the transition word for, or another linking word, but a linking word is not required. Prong C requires the phrase means, or the substitute term not be, modified by sufficient structure or material for performing the specified function. Prong A is met when the claim limitation explicitly uses the phrase means, or a generic placeholder for means. Prong B is met when the phrase means, or the substitute term is modified by functional language, typically linked by the transition word for, as in means for, or another linking word. For example, the claim recitation of means for ink delivery would meet prong B since the phrase means has been modified by the function of ink delivery. Similarly, the generic placeholder module, which in this case is being used as a substitute for means, is modified by the function delivering ink. Each of these examples would meet prong B of the three-prong analysis to invoke 112F. It is not required that the transition word for be used to link means or the substitute term to the function. Other linking words can be used, such as so that or configured for, provided it is clear that a function is being recited. In certain circumstances, it is also not necessary to use a linking word if other words used convey the function without imparting structure. Examples are ink delivery means and module configured to deliver ink. Prong C is met when the phrase means or the generic placeholder is not further modified by sufficient structure or material for performing the claimed function. For example, the claim recitation of means for ink delivery does not include any structural recitation. Therefore, prong C is met. However, the recitation of inkjet means for ink delivery includes a structural recitation of an inkjet, which is structure for performing the claimed function of ink delivery. Thus, it would fail prong C. Similarly, the recitation of means for ink delivery having an ink delivery tube is modified by structure for performing the claimed function and would also fail prong C. If the phrase means for or step for, or the substitute term or generic placeholder, is preceded by a modifier that has a known structural meaning in the art, then it will fail prong C. Note, however, that not all modifiers have a known structural meaning. Examples given in MPEP 2181-I-C are colorant selection mechanism, lever moving element, and moving link member. Shown here are examples of structural terms that have been found not to invoke 112F, regardless of being coupled with functional language. Be careful to distinguish between such structural terms and the generic placeholders or terms that are used as a substitute for means for. To determine whether a claim term is structural, Check the specification to see if it provides a description of the claimed term that would be sufficient to inform one of ordinary skill in the art the term denotes structure. Also check subject matter specific dictionaries and the prior art to see if the claimed term has either recognition as a noun denoting structure or an art-recognized structure to perform the claimed function. For example, the structural terms listed here would not typically invoke 35 U.S.C. 112F, filter, brake, clamp, screwdriver, or lock. Once you have identified a means type limitation that invokes 112F, then you should determine whether the boundaries of the claim scope are clear enough for compliance with 35 U.S.C. 112B. Make this determination by referring to the specification to identify the structure that performs the claimed function. Each means-type claim limitation and associated functional language must be considered based on the structure, material, or acts described in the specification and equivalents that perform the function. For a computer-implemented limitation that invokes 35 U.S.C. 112F, a general-purpose computer is usually sufficient for the corresponding structure for performing a general computing function, but the corresponding structure for performing a specific function is required to be more than simply a general-purpose computer or microprocessor. Examiners should therefore determine whether the claimed function is one that can be achieved by any general-purpose computer without special programming, or one that cannot be performed by any general-purpose computer. See examples on the next slide. An example of a function that can be achieved by a general-purpose computer without special programming might be means for processing data. An example of a function that must be performed by a special-purpose computer might be control means to control displayed images, to define a set of predetermined arrangements for a given game depending on the player's selections, and to pay a prize when a predetermined arrangement of symbols was displayed. When the specification does not disclose sufficient structure to perform the claimed function of a 35 U.S.C. 112F limitation, then the claim should be rejected under 35 U.S.C. 112B as being indefinite. The question to ask when considering 112F in relation to 112A and B is, does the written description adequately describe the structure, material, or acts necessary to support the means or step plus function recitation? For all claim limitations invoking 112F, a rejection under 112A typically accompanies a rejection under 112B. A term in associated functional language satisfies 35 U.S.C. 112A and B if the written description links particular structure, material, or acts to the recited function, or if it is clear that one skilled in the art would know what structure, material, or acts perform the recited function. You must reject a claim under 112A and B when USC 112F has been invoked and there is no corresponding structure for the function disclosed, or there is no clear linkage between the corresponding structure and the claimed function, and the corresponding structure is not sufficiently specific to perform the claimed function. If it is unclear whether 112F is invoked, then a rejection under 112B would be proper. When the disclosure only implicitly or inherently discloses the structure, then object to the specification using form paragraph 7.34.20. Let's revisit our camera example. We must first decide if the claim limitations recite means plus function language. The first and third limitations clearly meet the first and second prongs of the test. The specification only employs the term system and provides no further structural description for this term. The question here is there sufficient structure to perform the recited functions in the claim? A review of the claim language shows no structure at all is recited in the claim. Therefore, the claim language constitutes a limitation subject to the requirements of 35 U.S.C. 112F. 35 U.S.C. 112F requires the examiner to interpret the claim limitation as covering the structure disclosed in the specification for performing the function recited in the claims or equivalents thereof. For the remainder of the example, we will consider only the limitation of system for zooming the image recited in the example. The specification discloses Digital Zoom Processor 200, which operates on the image by interpolating new pixels between existing pixels using the equation shown. Since the specification provides the algorithm equation for performing the function of zooming by the processor, there is sufficient structure provided in the disclosure to perform the function recited in the claim. Hence, the specification meets the requirements of 112B. Thus, Digital Zoom Processor 200 is the structure corresponding to the system for zooming limitation. Assume further that the examiner finds a reference that discloses a film camera apparatus, not a digital camera, and the camera in the reference comprises a lens, a mechanical zoom lens, and film. If the examiner can make a case that a mechanical zoom lens is an equivalent to a digital zoom processor, based on the application's specification, the prior art teachings found, the overall context of that limitation in the claim, etc., then the examiner may make that case. See the next few slides for factors to consider in deciding what is an equivalent. The mechanical zoom lens is not identical to the digital zoom processor, but are they equivalent? 35 U.S.C. 112F requires that a means-type claim limitation be interpreted to cover equivalents of structures disclosed in the specification for performing recited functions. But what is an equivalent? If the answers to these questions are yes, the prior art element performs the function specified in the claim, and no, the spec does not provide any explicit definition that excludes the prior art element as an equivalent, and yes, the prior art element is an equivalent of the system for zooming limitation, then a prima facie case of equivalence has been shown. The examiner should provide an explanation and rationale in the office action as to why the prior art element is an equivalent. Factors that will support such a conclusion are discussed in MPEP 2183 and on the next slide. Among the factors that support a conclusion of equivalence, MPEP 2183 sets forth the following: whether the two elements perform the claimed function substantially the same way and produce substantially the same result, whether one skilled in the art would recognize the interchangeability of the two elements, and whether there are only insubstantial differences between the two elements. If the examiner finds that a prior art element is an equivalent, then he or she should provide an explanation and rationale in the office action as to why the prior art element is an equivalent. The examiner also must decide if the claim as a whole would have been prima facie obvious and make a rejection under 35 U.S.C. 103 if appropriate. Even where the applicant has met that burden of proof and has shown that the prior art element is not equivalent to the structure, material, or acts described in the applicant's specification, the examiner must still make a 35 U.S.C. 103 analysis to determine if the claimed means or step plus function is obvious from the prior art to one of ordinary skill in the art. When a claim element recites classic means for performing a function, presume 35 U.S.C. 112F is invoked. If a claim element recites another non-structural word coupled to a function, apply 35 U.S.C. 112F and make the record clear by using form paragraph 7.34.21. If applicant successfully rebuts the presumption that means-type functional language was not intended, then the examiner must now interpret the claim limitation under 35 U.S.C. 112F. Must the examiner now perform a new search, possibly leading to a new rejection? If the examiner did a complete search of the invention as disclosed and claimed, then a new search should not be necessary. The examiner should search both the disclosed and claimed invention to provide a thorough search in the first action. If the examiner switches from one subject matter to another in the claims presented by applicant in successive amendments, or from one set of references to another in successive actions, then this will tend to defeat the goal of reaching a clearly defined issue for an early termination. During patent examination, if claim language does not meet the three-pronged test for invoking 112F, then it must be given its broadest reasonable interpretation consistent with the specification. Under principles of compact prosecution, the examiner should make all reasonable rejections in the first office action and anticipate in the search what the applicant has claimed and might reasonably be expected to claim. The examiner should make a backup rejection under 35 U.S.C. 103, if appropriate, in the first office action to deal with obviousness of substitution of equivalents, anticipating the applicant may narrow the claim to recite the structure, material, or acts set out in the specification. If the applicant does not amend the claim, and if the examiner did not make the backup 103 rejection, the examiner must maintain their original ground of rejection if they want to make the action final. You will now have the opportunity to test your understanding with a few more examples of claim limitations that may or may not invoke 112F. In this revised example, we have a claim limitation that does provide structure for the transducer means as being to read write heads. The question the examiner must determine is, does the inclusion of the two heads provide enough structure to provide the claimed function of writing digital information on and reading digital information from? The explanation of why or why not is critical. If you determine that the claim language, even though it employs means for or step for language, does not invoke 35 U.S.C. 112F, then this must be explained in the office action. In this example, we see the claim limitation of a connector assembly for connecting each pair of adjacent support members. We then ask ourselves, does this limitation invoke 35 U.S.C. 112F, and why or why not? In reviewing the claim, we see that it employs the claim limitation of connector assembly. The claim does not use means for. However, it does employ the non-structural term assembly. We also see the term connector before assembly. So the question for the examiner is, does connector before assembly convey structure such that it does not meet the third prong of the analysis? The specification in the prior art shows that connector assembly is structured, and therefore the claim limitation would not invoke 35 U.S.C. 112F. In this example, it will be necessary to state in the office action that 35 U.S.C. 112F has not been invoked, since it would appear that the applicant intended to do so. You should now be more familiar with 35 U.S.C. 112F claim language, what is required under 112F, how to recognize if a claim invokes 112F, what happens if the claim is not found to fall under 112F, and how to evaluate an applicant's response to our determination of whether 112F has been invoked. Here are some further resources you can review on 35 U.S.C. 112F.